Hello and welcome back to For the Penguins. My name is Micaela Mlikota and I'm going to be your host. Thank you so much for joining. So last week we talked with Kayla and Alice about sustainable interior design. We all know that to reach our sustainable goals, we're going to need to have some pretty creative solutions, and she gives some really good examples of how to do so. This week we're going to be talking to Becca. She works in project financing, specifically in renewable energy projects. So a lot of the times people ask us, how is this getting paid for? She's going to explain exactly that. So if you're interested in that or you want to get into that industry, stay tuned and let's get to it. Let's learn about project financing. Hey, hello. Welcome to my passion project. So tell me, why are you here? What do you do?
Well, I am here because I work in project finance. And what my job is essentially finding money to build really large renewable energy projects. So I work with banks who lend us money during the construction period, but then also people that are interested in owning either all or a portion of renewable energy projects, or people who are interested in owning projects for tax purposes, because renewable energy projects have these really rich tax benefits. So basically, my job is to sort of source and execute on funding opportunities to build renewables.
Okay, so when you say large renewable projects, you mean like solar on top of your roof?
No, so what I mean is utility scale renewables.
Oh.
So that's, wind, solar, anything you see out in those big fields when you're on your cross country road trip. And we're starting to branch out more into things like transmission, green hydrogen, things like that.
Ooh, so expensive.
Yes.
What's the range do you think that a project would cost?
I mean, it's pretty crazy. I think, I've worked on projects as small as $100 million and ones that top 1 billion. So,
Okay.
these projects, it really depends on, where you're located, what technologies you're using, and then really what the size is.
Okay. So you said it's hard, and you mentioned um different areas in which you can get your money, no, different entities in which you can get your money from. Why so many entities? Is it just going to the bank, getting a loan, and you're done?
Yeah, so you can do that. But what many renewable energy companies realize is that it doesn't make sense for the renewable energy company to just pay for a project outright with cash they have in the bank, because they would rather use their money that they have to redevelop new projects, break into new markets and sort of expand their own business. And so if they use all their cash on building just one project, um, it kind of limits you to what you can build. So instead, we look for third party financing. So that usually starts as us going to a bunch of banks and asking for a construction loan and seeing who has the most competitive terms, like interest rate and tenor and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And then also figuring out a plan for the financing of a project during its operations. So that can be, getting a small amount of debt from a bank again, but that sort of only covers a portion of the total project costs.
Uh-huh.
And then also like talking to utilities, seeing if they're interested in owning a portion or all of a project. Talking to tax equity providers, and those are usually like big banks or big corporations that pay a lot in taxes, and what they can do instead of paying those taxes is buy a portion of the renewable energy project, and take the tax benefits that the project generates.
Okay. So it sounds like you have to work with banks, utilities, third party. What's it called? Third party financiers. Financiers. I'm not. As you can tell, I do not work in finance. So wait. So what's your background? What did you study, and how did you end up work doing this job?
Yeah, it's funny because I never thought that I would be working in sort of the renewables or climate space. I kind of figured, I don't have a STEM background. As much as I want to sort of help the planet and I feel like we're in this big climate disaster, I'm not an engineer, and so I'm not going to really be able to use my skills. And thankfully learned pretty quickly that that's very wrong. But maybe to start with my background, I went to Lawrence University, which is a small liberal arts school up in Wisconsin, and I studied economics and political science, and I minored in Spanish.
Ooh,
And
español.
see, um, and I, actually really was interested in going and getting a PhD in political science,
Oh
straight
wow.
after college. But, basically everyone I knew that had a PhD, whether that be family members or professors or just friends who were in PhD programs, everyone said, just take at least 1 year and figure out if that's really what you want to do, because it's a big commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And so my senior year, instead of applying to grad programs, I spent it job searching. And I'm really glad I got that advice, because otherwise I think my life would be pretty different than it is right now.
Yeah, how long is a PhD program?
Usually 5 to 7 years. So
Wow.
that would have been,
So you would still be in it right now.
yeah, I'd be giving up a big portion of my 20s. And, I still think it's a really interesting career path to take, but I think I also kind of stumbled upon a much more fulfilling one for me.
Okay, so what was your first job out of college? Was it in the sustainable space?
It wasn't. So I worked at a company called Fitch Ratings right out of college. It is a bond rating agency. So if you've ever heard something like, Fitch downgraded the state of Illinois from, AA to AA minus, or things like that. That's a bond rating agency. And so
Okay.
basically, what a bond rating agency does is tell investors or lenders how likely a common debt issuer is to pay back any sort of loan.
Oh.
And they do that via a rating system.
Okay, so still working with loans, just not with renewable energy at all.
Well, so they kind of gave me an option of what team to pick
Okay.
when I got accepted into their post college program, and there were like U.S. corporates, corporate mortgage-backed securities, residential mortgage-backed securities, all of those I was not too keen on. But there was one, and I think because I was a political science major, I realized, like this could be interesting, and it was called the Global Infrastructure and Project Finance Group.
Oh.
Um,
Okay.
and so what that was is we rated a lot of municipal infrastructure projects, so like toll roads, airports, seaports, even some sports stadiums, which were pretty cool.
Oh.
But then we also had a smaller portion of a project finance portfolio, which was mainly energy facilities, whether that be your more traditional thermal energy facilities like pipelines and like cogen facilities. There were some transmission projects, and there were also some renewable projects.
Okay.
So that's where I spent my first year and a half out of college.
Nice. So okay, so you went into did you know that you wanted to get into the energy industry when you left college?
No, at that point, still no. I liked the infrastructure idea, but still, I was still kind of feeling out this. Do I want to go to grad school? Do I want to, continue working in finance? I wasn't really sure that I did. It was sort of a job that came to me. It had a sort of quantitative part to it, but it also had this sort of qualitative research aspect, which I liked. And, I wasn't a finance major, I was an economics major. So it was semi transferable, but there was still a lot of learning for me to do.
Okay. That's actually really cool. Okay, so fast forwarding to now, do you feel like the people around you that you work with, your team, do they have similar backgrounds than you?
Some do, some don't. So the more traditional path to get to where I am now is doing investment banking right out of college, which is usually you're doing either some sort of advisory or lending role. And usually the folks who end up at renewable energy developers on the project finance teams worked at an investment bank on their energy team. So I was at a rating agency on their infrastructure team, which was transferable enough, but it wasn't necessarily the quote unquote traditional path.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So how did you transition from Fitch Ratings to working now at a renewable energy development company?
Yeah, that's a good question. So
That's a great question. It's like I thought of it myself. Oh my god.
yeah, so that's a good question. I sort of realized after about a year at Fitch that, I was pretty interested in the renewable energy credits that I was looking at, but wasn't as crazy about doing like a toll road rating or an airport or a seaport. And so at the time I was like, I'm going to just kind of do all this self-learning about the renewables industry, and hopefully, that will kind of lead me to a path, more directly working at like a developer or a utility or something like that. So what I did was listen to a lot of podcasts, the Energy Gang, any of the like kind of OG green tech media podcasts. Those were kind of what I was diving into.
My competitors.
And also at the time picked up a book called Superpower, that was about a guy named Michael Skelly who was developing large-scale transmission assets in Middle America. And his company, Clean Line Energy Partners, actually folded, and the assets they were developing were actually sold to Invenergy and NextEra, two of the biggest developers in the U.S.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, the book does not paint those developers in the best light.
I mean, in a good enough light to make you want to work there.
But at the same time, I actually my office moved right across the street from Invenergy's headquarters. And I figured, I'm going to start my job search there because it's, the closest one to me. And if that doesn't work, then I'll look at the NGs, the NextEras, the NRGs, other renewable developers. But at the time, I really wanted to stay in Chicago and I wanted to work full time in renewables. So the Invenergy team, really made sense to me. And another thing that I really appreciated about it was that, being a woman in finance, and I'm sure you can relate to some degree as a woman in engineering, a lot of times you show up and you're the only woman in the room. And that's really intimidating, especially when you're, an early 20s female, just kind of trying to find her voice in a professional setting. And the project finance team at Invenergy is actually led by two women.
That is awesome.
So for me, culturally, I figured that would be a really great place for me to grow and find my voice. And was lucky enough to get a job as an analyst on the finance and capital markets team. And that's really where I sort of dove in 100% into working in climate finance.
That is awesome. You bring a really good point because I think, and the whole point of having these conversations is helping people find their path to working in a brand new industry that a lot of the time is also led by men. So, I mean, I'm going to be interviewing people of all different, genders and backgrounds or ethnicities all over the place. But it's really good to talk about those struggles to try to, like, when you're aiming towards something, try to aim it in a place that is comfortable for you.
Definitely. And I feel really lucky that I've been on teams that have really empowered me and kind of helped lift me up.
That is really nice. Okay, now let's talk about moolah. I really want to try to ask everyone that I'm interviewing to share the salary range, just so it's something that I think isn't talked about a lot. It's kind of a taboo subject, but it's good to know, especially when choosing a career path. And as you mentioned, it doesn't have to be a straight shot exactly what you did to get to where you are, but it's good to know. All right, these are my goals. These are my financial goals. Does it match the job that I'm trying to find? So I try to do it personalized to each person that I'm talking to. So this one today will be about we're going to categorize it in as personal finance management systems because I don't know anything else about finance, and I feel like just making it money would have been too on the dot. So if you make $40,000 a year or below, let's call it the Google Sheets category. If you make between $40,000 to $60,000 a year, I'm gonna upgrade it to Mint. Now, if you do $60,000 a year to $90,000 a year, we're gonna name that Quicken. And then 90K or above would be a wealth manager, which I didn't even know what that was until Becca told me earlier. So please go ahead and share your salary range.
Yeah, definitely. So my first 2 years out of college, I was pretty solidly in the Quicken range, which I think if you go into investment banking, you are, far and above that. So, folks want to keep that in mind. There's a ton of available information out on the internet about how analyst salaries at investment banks are structured. But, obviously with those, you're paying with all your free time.
Okay, that's good to know.
But
Again.
now I think starting from my third year sort of in the industry and above, even kind of my second and a half year and above, I've been in the wealth management category.
Nice, very fancy, very fancy. That's awesome to hear, and it's good to talk about this too because sometimes there's like that myth that working in anything that's sustainable, like I mean renewable energy and just the sustainability industry in general, means that you have to make less money. I don't know why, but that's good that we share that and see that it could be awesome too.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you play your cards right, you can really get a fruitful salary working in project finance.
That is awesome. And actually, kind of following that, but I hear that you guys get really cool gifts when you reach financial close on projects, which if you want to explain what financial close is, go ahead. But I also want to hear the interesting part, which is what's the coolest gift you ever gotten?
Yeah. So, to start, financial close is essentially when we get to the point with a lender or investor that they're comfortable. They've looked at our project with enough scrutiny. They've kind of had lawyers go through and diligence all the documents. Shout out to all the lawyers that spend a lot of late nights in the data room. But they've had, their teams go through, they've diligenced the project, they've kicked off independent engineers. all these steps, and then at the same time they've negotiated these financing docs, which are these really 200-page long legalese documents about the terms of the loan or the equity investment. Um, and on the day of financial close, we sign all those documents, we get the money. It's really satisfying for us because there's a lot of late nights and long hours that kind of lead up to that. And yeah, once we sign, for me working on the structuring side, my job is sort of done there, and it moves off to a separate portion of my team. So financial close is kind of like a party time for me. But for financial close, traditionally you get what's called a deal toy or a tombstone from a bank, which
Ooh.
is,
Why is it a tombstone? I feel like deal toy sounds a lot more fun.
they're basically these like glass plaques that you get to put on your desk, and usually, for renewable energy deals, they have like a bunch of wind turbines or solar farms. Or I've seen ones that have like the inside of like a cable on the inside, like if they've done an equipment loan facility or something like that. So they're pretty tailored to
It is
each
the most
specific
interesting
deal.
way to make something boring sound really
Yeah,
cool. You'd be like, here's a present.
Yeah. So oddly enough, though, the projects I've worked on haven't gotten any of those, but I have gotten a lot of engraved bottles of alcohol.
Ooh.
So there's one lender in particular I've worked with that, they've sent me a really nice bottle of wine, a bottle of like whiskey that has, all the projects we worked on together, the amount of the loans.
See, I am so jealous because engineers do not get this. I remember Becca and I met because we were working on the same project as well. And as she mentioned, when you reach financial close, you're kind of done and you move forward. That's when we kind of start, like officially. We're like, okay, everything's good to go, like on the design aspect. And I am still waiting for any type of design close present, but no one really wants to give me that. So,
Oh, Mika, this is an open invitation for you to come and drink that bottle of wine because it's still in my liquor cabinet.
Thank you. I gladly accept that.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because I think people don't like. For me, it's really easy to be like, okay, the loan's closed, like the project's done. They're just gonna build it, right? Like I don't really think a lot about like, oh, maybe there's something that's gonna go wrong at the substation and the project's gonna be delayed 2 months, or there's gonna be delays in the supply chain and we're not gonna get solar panels when we thought we did, and so. I try to keep in touch with the technical team on the projects I'm working with because otherwise I just kind of assume that they get built and there's no problems that ever happen on site.
That's a really good point. Like, there's a lot of things that can go wrong or well during the design and the construction of a project. I will definitely talk about those when I talk about the renewable engineering aspect of my job, which is the whole job. But I'll talk about that more when it's my own interview to myself. Another myth that I wanted to kind of debunk, or if not, just talk about a little bit more. We talked about the myth of working sustainability. You don't make as much money as everything else, which we can prove that is not the case. But what about building renewable energy projects? Do you find that it is really like is it not feasible? Like, is it really that much expensive? Like, are we gonna bankrupt the economy if we try to switch to renewables or green hydrogen?
Definitely not. These are really expensive projects, but any infrastructure project is really expensive. And it's also sort of where your priorities as society are, right? Like if you want to spend your money refurbishing old gas plants that have, dependency on potentially, international fuel sources. And as we've seen over the last few months, that can go really badly. If you want to spend, additional money on healthcare in communities that are getting, bearing the brunt of methane emissions or things like that, those are also expensive and they're not necessarily something that oil and gas companies have had to answer to. With renewables, obviously there's, I gave a range for project costs earlier, but we have found that investors are really interested in this. It's it's really being prioritized by utilities and sort of individual investors, whether that be like pension funds or whatever alike. And so the investor appetite is really there.
So there's definitely an interest for these projects.
Definitely. And I think, what a lot of people like to rail on is that, oh, well, these projects get all these tax breaks. And it's like, well, so do the fossil fuel ones. We just don't talk about those.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we get some tax benefits, and the IRA has solidified those for the next 10 years, which is really great, and I think gives developers a lot more security and a lot more sort of understanding on the viability of certain projects.
So, what is the IRA?
The IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act that was
Woo woo.
passed by President Biden earlier this year. It has a lot of different components, but it really, sort of kickstarted a lot of renewable energy development. I shouldn't say kickstarted. It really encourages a lot of renewable energy development across the U.S., whether that be for supply chain sort of fortification within the United States, or building the actual projects themselves, or looking into newer technologies, or strengthening our transmission grid. I think the number one thing that I would love to see, especially in the US, but really worldwide, is a build out of transmission infrastructure. We found that, for a lot of the energy needs in the United States, we can get there with wind and solar. And once we sort of figure out longer duration energy storage, we'll, be even closer. But like we were talking about earlier, so many of those resources are so far from where the need for the energy actually is. So if we could build out transmission infrastructure, and there's a lot of cool companies, large developers and small sort of startups alike that are working to improve transmission capacity in the U.S. I think if we could have like that full build out just instantaneously, that would really be a game changer.
I definitely agree. That's also a big portion of my job. So, absolutely agree. And I think not just the United States, but the whole world would agree with that. I know there's a lot of advances in that in Europe as well.
The last thing I'll say about whether or not projects are too expensive or whether or not they can compete with fossil fuels is that we're able to find buyers for the power, and at the end of the day, that's what important is, that our power prices are able to compete with traditional fossil fuel emissions.
Uh huh.
Our projects are able to compete with traditional fossil fuel sources of power, um, and we're actually finding that they're cheaper.
Okay.
So there are, some lingering issues with resource intermittency and, power grid transmission, or transmission capacity.
Mhm. Well, which that's why there's so many new transmission projects being built right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's to sort of help with the intermittency, and also just the fact that some of the best renewable resources in the country are located really far from where the power actually needs to be used.
Yeah, that makes sense because you need a lot of space to build these wind, solar farms, even storage. You kind of need space as well, and usually the places that need the most power are cities, which are a lot more congested. So, just for those that don't know, a transmission line is kind of like the main source of transportation of these of these generation facilities. No, so I guess so. Based on what you're saying, though, there's an interest for it from banking and investors. It does compete with fossil fuels, but do you think that the policy that is in place helps develop these projects as well?
Yeah, I do. I think there's still room for improvement, but I think the Inflation Reduction Act did really solidify. The first thing it did was it solidified sort of the investment tax credit and the production tax credit that renewable energy projects are
Mm-hmm.
eligible for. Previously they would only extend it for a few years at a time. Now we have it for the next 10 years, and we know that we have it.
Okay.
Um, so that alone just erases a lot of sort of anxiety about, whether or not projects are going to qualify, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. The Department of Energy also has a loan programs office that was significantly bolstered by the Inflation Reduction Act, which
Mm-hmm.
should help a lot of newer technologies as well as transmission projects gain funding. Because a lot of times banks don't want to take technology risk
Mm-hmm.
on new projects. If it's green hydrogen or long duration energy storage, there's sort of this green premium that banks are putting on it because the technology is not proven, and banks are pretty risk averse
I
when
didn't
it
know
comes to
that.
infrastructure investments. Yeah. So, they might be able to underwrite a portion of it, but it will come at a lot higher of an interest rate, things like that. So, I believe there are programs within the Inflation Reduction Act,
Mm-hmm.
within the Department of Energy, to actually provide loans for these projects, which is
Oh.
really exciting.
Okay. So it's funny because you studied political science, and and even though your job is in finance, you definitely have to be aware of all the policy changes that are happening in the government.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like this industry so much is,
Mm-hmm.
they're really entwined.
Okay. That's awesome. That is very, very cool. So the last thing that I want to ask you is if you have any advice for people that are listening to this right now and think that your job is super cool and would like to get into this industry.
Yeah, I think for anyone that wants to work in this field, the first thing to know is that you're really going to need to have strong financial modeling skills. So whether
Okay.
you learn that in school or in your first year in investment banking, being able to create financial models in Excel, or I should say, or on your own. What through courses, online like Pivotal 180 or Wall Street Prep or things like that.
Okay.
Having really good Microsoft Excel skills to build financial models is going to be really important in the early stages of your career because that's going to be a lot of your job.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, though, just be excited about the industry. I found that, even when we're interviewing people that maybe don't have all the experience we need, um, if they're passionate, if they're read up on the industry, if they're listening to those podcasts, things like that, and they're really excited and you can tell, I think that does go a long way in this industry because people really want to this is a field where a lot of people are really mission driven, myself included.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to feel that you're surrounding yourself with people that are also really mission driven.
I love that, and I agree with that too. That's kind of how I got my job. I don't think I was that qualified either, but I was like, please, I love it so much, and they're like, okay, and here we are. So,
Yeah.
okay, well, thank you so much for coming and telling me all about your job and helping other people hopefully find an interest in this and then follow your steps.
Yeah, thank you for having me.